Kirsti, I'm really glad to be sitting with you here today for the latest in our Mayer Brown 10 Key Questions series. As co-head of our global projects and infrastructure team, I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say today. So can we just kick off by asking, please, can you talk to us a bit about how the current situation in Ukraine has led to very much a focused attention on the energy sector?
Yep, sure. I mean, the Ukraine crisis, I think, has highlighted the role that to date Russian oil and gas has played in the energy mix, particularly in Europe. And as a result, we've now got into a lot of questions around energy security of supply. It's also, I think, compounded the price volatility in the wholesale energy market. Even before the Ukraine crisis, we were seeing quite a lot of volatility and price rises in the energy market. But the situation in Ukraine, I think, has really exacerbated that. And the other thing I think it's worth noting is that whilst it's focused on security of supply issues, it's also meant that people have looked once again at the need to reduce carbon emissions, and that renewable energy is seen as an important part of the energy security supply question.
We've all seen in the press huge amounts about the significant rises in energy prices. Can you just explain what sort of implications will that have for our clients?
Potentially, the implications are really quite significant, particularly if your business is one where you're an intensive user of energy. Your energy costs are a significant part of your overhead. So we're seeing clients really having to think carefully about how they mitigate against energy price rises. Now, that can mean putting in place various hedging mechanisms, which themselves may demand quite a lot by way of credit support. And so the implications are very, very significant. But people are thinking quite creatively about how they mitigate those costs. For example, we're seeing an increased focus and attention on perhaps having your own sources of energy or power generation, whether that's rooftop solar, connecting into directly to generation plants.
And one of the expressions I've heard quite a lot is energy security. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, you're right. It's a real focus of a number of governments, including the UK government. A couple of weeks ago, they published a new energy security supply strategy. In its very basic form, energy security is about securing a reliable and affordable source of energy. But I think in the current environment, it's a little bit more than that as well. So in addition to reliability and affordability, there's a need to think about the emissions aspect of energy as well. So you're looking at also trying to secure green energy sources to the extent possible.
And what can be done to guarantee energy security?
It's a very difficult question, because I think the global energy market is a complex market. The supply chains are really quite complicated. So I'm not sure we'll ever get to a guaranteed position. But I think key to securing your energy supplies is to have a real mixed portfolio of energy resources available to you. So everything from renewable generation through to nuclear to LNG. But it's not just about, I think, the energy molecules themselves. Part of the security of supply issue, I think, is tied up with the infrastructure that you need to support the energy supply. So whether that's making sure your transmission network can accommodate renewables and the intermittent nature of that generation, or whether it's port infrastructure that can accommodate LNG, whether it's the infrastructure you need to accommodate hydrogen more broadly in the market.
And what will the impact be of the crisis on things like net zero, renewables, energy transition?
That, I think, is an interesting one, because whilst the crisis obviously is a real negative, in some ways it's presenting a positive momentum behind the push for renewables and net zero. No longer is it seen just as a good thing to do from an environmental perspective, but there is a role to play in the security of supply, and there's real momentum now behind, I think, the rollout of renewable and net zero type technologies.
And in the long term, do you think this will help or hinder developments?
I think it will help developments in the longer term. I think we're already seeing governments looking at what they can do in terms of regulatory frameworks, efficiencies in permitting and planning processes, and setting up sort of support arrangements. So, for example, whether that's feed-in tariffs or whether it's contract for differences or even the creation of hydrogen hubs, those kinds of things to really help push the renewables and the net zero energy mix along.
And I mean, clearly globally there's a huge push on sort of alternative energy sources. Can you just talk through what some of those might look like?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of alternatives out there, it's fair to say, and there's no one size fits all. So one market may work very well with a particular type of technology, but I think we're looking at everything from LNG, which has been around for many years, but is increasingly important, I think, in the energy mix. There's hydrogen, there's renewable, including offshore wind, and in particular floating offshore wind. I think the battery and storage technologies that are there are incredibly important in helping accommodate some of these new technologies within the energy mix and the energy system. But also, I think people tend to forget about some of the technologies that we can use to help our processes become more efficient and the demand side management of our energy consumption.
LNG, that's liquefied natural gas. So what are you thinking is going to happen with the sort of current situation on that market and those sort of projects?
I think we're already seeing an uptick in the demand for LNG and LNG projects. And people are looking to secure supplies on a long-term basis. Now that in and of itself raises issues because you can contract for a longer term, but obviously there are price implications and you may get into issues of price reopening. But there are also the infrastructure aspects of this. So whilst the demand for LNG is increasing, how can that demand be met? It's not just a question of the LNG molecules again, it's also things like the availability of vessels, the port infrastructure. Can it accommodate additional tankers coming in? What are the regasification what's the regasification sort of setup like?
And what about hydrogen projects?
There's been a lot of talk around hydrogen, and I think the Ukraine crisis is really going to provide added momentum to the rollout of hydrogen projects. We're already seeing it in the UK with the creation of hydrogen hubs, but most jurisdictions around the world have some hydrogen strategy. In Asia, for example, there's a real focus on ammonia. In Europe, there's a focus on green hydrogen. In the UK, on green and blue hydrogen. So it's a really important part of the energy transition and the new energy mix going forward. And I think what is quite interesting in terms of where we find ourselves right now is that up until now, I think hydrogen was always seen as a really expensive option. But given where wholesale energy prices are currently, perhaps it doesn't look quite so expensive as it once did.
That's all really, really interesting, Kirsti. Just finally, before you go, from your perspective, what would you say the key takeaways for any of our clients watching are?
I think there are a number of things to really think carefully about. First of all, it's the risk mitigation. We're being asked by clients to look at complex contractual sort of matrices that surround these projects and ensuring that you mitigate, you identify, mitigate and manage the risks within that complex contractual matrix is important. I think regulatory change is happening and it's happening quite quickly, so keeping on top of the regulatory environment that you operate in is key. I also think it's worth recognising that whilst the Ukraine crisis and the energy transition is presenting challenges, it's also presenting opportunities. We're seeing significant numbers of new participants in the market. There are joint ventures that are being set up in ways we've not seen previously, but also the types of financing that is being required and the systems to facilitate and mobilise that capital are really being focused on. And we're seeing some complex hybrid blended financing type structures. So whilst I think there are challenges, certainly from my perspective, I think there are real opportunities available as well.